Hi, everyone. My name is Sebastian Bielski. I'm a senior studying sustainable planning and urban design. I also have a minor in business and political science. Thank you for joining me today. I'll be presenting on my thesis, The Regeneration of Thamesmead, and I'll suggest how the British planning system can better reconcile racial discriminations of the past and inequities of the present. I worked alongside Dr. Danielle Rivera, Mr. Peter McLennan, and Dr. Paul Chernowski on my thesis. This image is infamous in the design community. The fall of Pruitt Igoe. The project began as a housing marvel. Within 2 decades, ended in rubble. The world-famous image of its demolition has helped to perpetuate an image of the failure of government-sponsored housing that has stigmatized public housing residents. Pruitt Igoe is told to be filled with violence, crime, and drugs, so the story goes. From near the beginning, it became a dumping ground for the poorest residents of St. Louis. Further examination into Pruitt Igoe takes into account the ways in which public housing was used as a tool for racial segregation as a justification for the clearance of poor working class communities. Only constructed a few years later, east of the city of London was Thamesmead. Thamesmead was known for its innovative design and groundbreaking architecture, similar to that of Pruitt Igoe. It was classified and known as the town of tomorrow, and was even recognized by the Boston Globe as a future public housing for Britain and in the United States. When it was initially constructed, the community was predominantly white and working class, but now after decades of disinvestment into the community, the demographic makeup is very different. Thamesmead now houses the largest percentage of the community identifying as Black African in all of the United Kingdom, and the community is currently being regenerated. Regeneration, meaning in the British context, a large-scale project intended to promote economic growth, as well as smaller-scale works that target improving the quality of life for people in a community, similar to what we would have as a redevelopment scheme in the States. Thamesmead is a several billion-pound regeneration project and has so far demolished 6 housing blocks in the community housing the largest Black African population in the United Kingdom. Does this story sound familiar to you? We need to understand Thamesmead through the lens of race, as it'll be a precedent for housing projects and housing redevelopment schemes for decades to come in Britain and beyond. My main objectives in my thesis were to better understand the British regeneration model as opposed to the American redevelopment scheme of public housing projects. Furthermore, I wanted to understand the racial impact on the communities that are being regenerated in the United Kingdom. And ultimately, I wanted to explore the ways to improve the current model of the British regeneration system and their planning system in general, as it's a model internationally that people follow and take close notes off of. I began my literature review by uncovering the housing histories of both the United States and the United Kingdom. And it's important to know that beginning in the 1980s, both countries heavily switched to a housing system fueled by private investment. And this was based on the similar goals of conservative governments of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan. So since this switch to private investment and privatism, the US has redeveloped housing projects through policies like Hope 6, and the British have regenerated their housing projects. So they have very similar histories within public housing. However, there was heavy evidence in the American literature of the negative racial impacts of public housing redevelopment and a disturbing gap of discussion on the British side. Simply, the British planning scholars did not discuss race as extensively as American scholars did. However, there was strong inclination to believe that there were similar effects happening in the UK that just were not studied. But furthermore, I also studied the work of Dr. Yasmina Bibi-Juan to learn more about the conceptualizations of race in British planning. Generally, British planning can be separated into 3 different eras: immigration, multiculturalism, and community cohesion diversity, which is what we currently exist in now. In the immigration era, the British saw immigrants as a challenge to the nation and managed them by separating them into the most deprived areas of the urban fabric. In the multiculturalism era, they managed culturally different groups by spatially organizing them. In the community cohesion and diversity era, they attempted to make the integration of self-segregating ethnic groups. But based off of recent social movements around the world calling for change and for justice, I believe there's strong evidence to suggest that there needs to be new concepts of understanding how to address racial inequities within British housing. So when trying to find a new framework, I identified reparative planning as a solution to the need for expansion of current housing policy. Reparative planning challenges white supremacy in both its socioeconomic and socio-ideational dimensions by suggesting how to make reparations to historically marginalized communities in the planning process and in planning developments. So it addresses planning's entanglement also with white supremacy and white ignorance, and racial capitalism through this system of reparations to historically discriminated communities in planning schemes in general. So I wanted to build off the work of Dr. Bibi, and I suggest a model of reparative planning. I believe this is a critical framework to discuss as it advances on the racial justice movement by making a system of reparations and is applicable to the long histories of racism in planning that needs to be addressed urgently. So this led me to my research question. Given the emerging frameworks of reparative planning, what are the practices and policies needed to address racism in British housing regeneration? I first began by doing intensive research on the history of Thamesmead over time, understanding how the site evolved as demographics evolved. I next analyzed a plethora of public-facing documents to understand how racism operates within Thamesmead. I used a robust coding system to document how different site plans, interviews, promotional videos, films, advertisements portrayed Thamesmead and how the rhetoric used and actions represented the different conceptualizations of race in planning. So I used this information to understand the inequities forming on the site over time due to outdated frameworks of planning and how these inequities formed over time to find the correlating movements within different planning policies that contributed to this long legacy of racism and discrimination within Thamesmead. So for reference, I chose my case study based on my case study design outlined by Yin. I wanted to have a single case study within a given context, better understand how different planning theories interact with Thamesmead. Additionally, I used Saldana's thematic analysis for my coding in order to have a framework for understanding how to analyze these various documents. My analysis started from understanding the histories and legacies of Thamesmead over time from the perspectives of development and regeneration, media portrayal, how it fits within the global context of what's happening in housing movements, and the demographic shifts in the UK and specifically within Thamesmead. So as an example, this film is A Clockwork Orange for those who are unfamiliar with it. And this is a very infamous scene that was actually shot and filmed in Thamesmead. So ever since this film that portrays Thamesmead in the light of crime and violence in a dystopic society, Thamesmead has garnished the name A Clockwork Estate, and its legacy is carried on until today. So I analyzed things like this on how our portrayal of communities have fueled long-standing legacies of racism and discrimination that we need to address in current regeneration schemes of housing communities like this. So my main analysis derives from a cross-analysis over time of influences of different ethnic groups in the Thamesmead to identify the acts of segregation, acts that have divided the community over time. Notably, I found that there's a pattern division after major demographic shifts. Firstly, after the influx of Vietnamese refugees in Thamesmead shifting from a white majority community to community housing different groups of immigrants, a highway was built through the site, physically dividing the community. In the 1990s, when West African populations moved into Thamesmead, a new group called Galleon took over that closed down public spaces to not complete the services that were promised and called for the demolition of housing. Now, a private developer called Peabody is employing demolition tactics similar to what we saw in Pruitt Igoe decades before to the largest West African community in the UK, as they had publicly claimed that their houses are simply too hard to renovate. So for my analysis, I also analyzed Thamesmead from the conceptualizations of race identified by Bibi. I looked at the construction in the A2016 and how that highway physically divided the community, as well as how films like A Clockwork Orange led to the reputation of Thamesmead being a sink estate, as well as like the introduction of Crossrail into the area, which is a new tube line, how that poses a threat of gentrification for Thamesmead residents. So in order to implement reparations in the regeneration scheme, we have to first understand the major inequities that face Thamesmead currently. And from my analysis, I'd uncovered that there's 5 major inequities that need to be addressed first. The first one is historic transit inequality and the threat of gentrification from transit-oriented development. Secondly, the inadequate housing and the forced displacement of people from their homes through the redevelopment process. Third, the failed realization of self-sufficient community as schools and grocery stores and parks and all these things that were promised the residents of Thamesmead in the 60s were never accomplished and never actually built. Fourth, the destruction of cultural identity, specifically the demolition of the Lakeside Center in the past 2 years, which was a strong symbol for the community and culture of Thamesmead that was demolished for new housing. And equity in the planning process, addressing the inequities that have been brought up by different communities within Thamesmead, how they were inadequately engaged in the planning process. So from these inequities, I created a reparative list of reparations that needed to be made or to solve the racial inequities that are at Thamesmead. So a few examples are reduced or free transit fares paid for residents who are physically separated from transit access due to the construction in the 2016, specifically the Vietnamese refugees and their descendants who were divided when the construction of this highway was done, as well as making economic reparations for all communities who were forced to move from their current residences. And I'm also calling for no rent increases for all households who were displaced at any point in the regeneration process. As well as for any future films, as the developer wants Thamesmead to be a center for films in London, all Thamesmead residents should receive a stipend for any film that's produced within their community to make it a more equitable share of those profits that the film industry is getting off of Thamesmead. These are just a few examples of the reparations that I'm calling for in my thesis. So my conclusions are largely theoretical implications about how regeneration can be based on reparations and policy and practical implications on how this could be employed within Thamesmead. I suggest that the regeneration in Thamesmead needs to be centered on reversing both the wrongful gains and losses of communities over time. A central organizing principle of the regeneration should be corrective, reparative, and transitional justice. Overall, the rejection and dismantling of white supremacy in the planning process. I suggest that this can manifest by ensuring a legacy for symbols of cultural identity for Thamesmead communities, such as housing units and green spaces. Also allowing the marginalized groups to assert self-determination and self-development during the regeneration process. I also want to encourage marginalized communities to set their own planning goals and enact their own planning policies to combat white ignorance of the actual problems that need to be addressed in the regeneration scheme. And overall, having economic reparations for those people who were forced to relocate and suffered from transit inequity since Thamesmead's opening. Thank you very much for watching my brief overview of my thesis today, and I look forward to discussing more with people in future Q&A sessions. Thank you again.